Once again, this is the Essential C.S. Lewis. We're in week 2. So thanks again for coming back, those of you that did. I'm going to start with a quick word of prayer. Dear Lord, we just pray for your blessings on the next 50 minutes as we go into mere Christianity, Lord. Ultimately, all this wisdom, this insight, this truth and light comes from you. We know that you use different vessels to communicate it, and some people are better at it than others. But ultimately, Lord, the source is you. And really the purpose of it is for your glorification, for our edification. So I just pray that you bless this time. And I thank you once more for this opportunity to come and study this book together. I ask both in your name. Amen. All right, start with a little bit of a review with a little bit of a bonus. Cover some stuff that came up last week that I might not have been as prepared for as I should have been. So, quick class overview, and this has changed a little bit. Obviously, this is the second week, so last week we did introduction, and we covered chapter 1 of book 1 of Mere Christianity, which has 4 books. I might have said it had 3 last time, but I've looked at it again since. It's got 4 books, and we have to cover all of them. So, this week, I would like to cover book 1, which is, we finished chapter 1, and we'll do chapters 2 through 5 today, and that'll be the end of book 1. Next week is a heavy lift, so you might have to go kind of fast to do books 2 and 3. Then we'll do book 4 the next week. Then we'll get into Screwtape letters. We'll do about 10 chapters each week. Before I had week 7 as kind of a great divorce, abolition of man, but things were just taking longer to go through than I expected. So I'll try to weave that in throughout when possible. Someone asked last class about a reading schedule, and I didn't really give one, but I want to try something different. I know that the normal sort of book club structure is, you read chapter 1, then you discuss chapter 1, then you read chapter 2, and you discuss chapter 2. I want to flip that. So we talked about chapter 1 last week. So ideally, you would have read chapter 1 by yourself over this past week. Today, we'll talk about the end of book 1. So to prepare for next week's class, it'd be great if you could read book 1, if that makes sense. So first, we'll do the lecture on the section, then you go back and read it. Again, I think that this is just way easier to go through if you kind of know where the author is going, what sort of things he's going to cover and what kind of turns he's going to make. Again, it's not necessary, but I think you will see that I'm not really covering these books in their full justice. I'm sort of raising questions. I'm not going to tell you all the answers. So Lewis will have those for you. But that's kind of the structure, and that's the reading schedule. Does that make sense? It's different? Okay, great. Okay, recap on his life. Lewis, strapping young lad, born in 1898, dies in 1963. I misspoke a couple of times in the last class and said he fought in World War II. Forget about that. He just fought in World War I. World War I is the word that he fought in. World War II is when he's putting out Mere Christianity as a radio broadcast and when he's published Screwtape letters. So both wars are important for him, but he did fight in the first one, and he's an Oxford professor during the second one. Someone also asked about his conversion. Now, Lewis has a great conversion story, and so I kind of wanted to talk to you about 2 dates that are important in his conversion story. I'm not going to go into the fullness of them, but the first one is September 19th, 1931. Again, Lewis was born in 1898, so he would have been about 33 years old. Again, older than me, certainly. He's coming to Christianity later in life, but he talks about losing his faith as a young child, and then he describes this progression that as he grew and as he talked to more and more people, he sort of came step by step closer to Christianity, closer to Christ. So he talks about going from becoming an atheist to more of a theist, and then from a theist to someone who's willing to consider a personal God. But I think because he grew up in the Christian tradition, he was kind of biased against it for a really long time. He just did not want to accept it. But he has this conversation on September 19th, 1931, with 2 of his close friends, a man named Hugo Dyson and, of course, J.R. Tolkien. And they are just pleading with him to become a Christian. They're just telling him everything that you've been studying, everything that moves you deeply, it's founded in the Christian tradition, right? So why not take the plunge? Why not become a Christian? And he talks about some of his difficulties. Now, I'll just read a brief passage from, I have here a biography of Lewis by another author named Derek Bingham, and he describes kind of the end of this conversation. What they talk about is Lewis's relationship to myth and Christianity. Lewis always loved myth. He always loved stories in Greek mythology and Norse mythology about gods dying and resurrecting. And Tolkien and Dyson were trying to get him to see that Christianity is a true myth, in that there is a true story of a god dying and resurrecting. And if you accept the truth of that, it actually changes your relationship with that god. So I'll read a quick section from this biography talking about this conversation that they had. Tolkien and Dyson carefully sought to show Lewis that the story in the Gospels really happened. Tolkien pointed out that this is a God who is real and whose dying can transform those who believe in him. A gust of wind came through the trees and leaves fell on Jack's shoulders, but more than leaves fell that evening. Spiritual insight fell too, that was to have wonderful results. They talked until 3 o'clock in the morning, then Tolkien decided he'd better go home to his wife. Hugo, Dyson, and Lewis continued to walk and talk further. The pair of them strolled up and down the arcades of new buildings, Dyson urging Lewis to believe all that the gospel story presented. Dyson emphasized that in believing in Christ and his gospel, a person receives peace and forgiveness of sins and can become a new person. And this was a very influential conversation in Lewis's life. And it happened on a certain walking path on the Oxford campus called Addison's Walk. I didn't get to take this picture, but when Faith and I went on that trip a couple months ago, got to walk down it and see, there's a plaque for him. So it's this very charged moment. And it's really 3 days later, September 22nd, 1931, where he describes going on this motorcycle ride. And I'll just read this for you. So it was that 3 days later, on the 22nd of September, 1931, Lewis got into the sidecar of his brother Warren's motorcycle, and the pair of them set off for Whipsnade Zoo in London. It was a bright, sunny morning. Lewis records that he did not spend the journey deep in thought. He had no inward emotional crisis whatsoever. But he confessed that when he got into the sidecar, he did not believe that Jesus is the Son of God. When he got out of the sidecar, he did. How did Lewis sum up what had happened? He likened the experience to a man lying motionless in bed after a long sleep, being suddenly aware that he is awake. Christ's Apostle John put it this way: "We have seen and testified that the Father has sent the Son, a Savior of the world. Whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God abides in him, and he in God. He who believes in the Son of God has the witness in himself, and this life is in his Son. He who has the Son has life. He who does not have the Son does not have life." And it sounds a little anticlimactic. You go on a motorcycle ride, pop out of the end of it as a Christian, but it's really this lifelong journey that Lewis goes on. Again, couldn't get fully into it today, but it's a story worth looking into. And I'll highlight another book. This is a book called The Everlasting Man by a writer named G.K. Chesterton, who is sort of the previous generation. He kind of starts writing at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th. And he was a big influence on C.S. Lewis. And Chesterton was a Catholic, but this book, The Everlasting Man, is kind of a work of apologetics. And it's kind of historical and anthropological. He starts out talking about paganism, the advent of Christianity, and how Christianity kind of made it impossible to sincerely be pagan anymore. It had this kind of worldwide consequence. It's sort of interesting. And a lot of what I love about Lewis, when it comes to Lewis's vision of myth and history, actually comes from this book that Chesterton wrote called The Everlasting Man. So flag that for you as kind of an excellent read. And if you like Lewis's writing style, if you like his similes and his metaphors, Chesterton is really a master of that writing style as well. So it's just kind of excellent prose. He's not an academic. He's got sort of a journalism background, so he writes kind of in a punchy, sort of clear way, but I'll flag that for you. Okay, I also wanted to talk about Anglicanism because it came up last week and I wasn't really prepared. So I did a little bit of research this week. This is from anglicangommunion.org. thankfully, I don't think we said anything too off base last week. When I looked at their doctrine, when I looked at their doctrinal statements, broadly speaking, I felt comfortable with them. They accept the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed. So I didn't see anything that jumped off the page as heretical to me. But as we said, it's not my tradition. So when we read works, we want to have that critical eye. But I wanted to flag this section of the website for you because they put this up. What's particularly distinctive about Anglicanism? So you can hear it straight from the horse's mouth. An important caveat about this question is that if you ask 3 Anglicans about doctrine, you'll get 5 different answers. Anglicanism's greatest strength, its willingness to tolerate a wide variety in Anglican faith and lifestyle, is also the thing that provokes the most debate among its practitioners. Now, this is on their website. I'm not paraphrasing. This is what they said. It's a selling point, how doctrinally diverse we are. Again, from any Protestant tradition I know, that's not the way we think of denominations. Well, for the most part, we think of them as doctrinally rigorous. That's what separates out a denomination. But you have these Anglicans here say, yeah, come on in. Water's fine. It's a big tent. We're all basically Christians. Here's another quote. Rather than saying Anglicanism is Protestant, like Lutheranism or Calvinism, rather it would be more accurate to say that it is Catholic, lowercase c Catholic, believing it is still part of God's one church, and having bishops as church leaders, but reformed, lowercase r, reformed, in that it shares the principles of other Christian churches that broke away from the Roman Catholic Church in the 16th century, in what has become known as the Protestant Reformation. When I first read this, it seemed a little unintelligible. You guys are Catholic and you're not Protestant, but you're Reformed. You know what exactly is going on. But this word Catholic, lowercase c Catholic, it just means universal, right? So I think what the Anglicans are saying is that you Protestants, you have the right idea, but you're a little rude, you're a little combative. Do we really have to break away from the entire tradition and start our own thing? No, we're united. That's sort of their perspective. But they're reformed when it comes to doctrine. So when it comes to some of the excesses of the Catholic Church and the way that tradition really diverted from Scripture, which kind of caused the Reformation, they, broadly speaking, agree with that. So this is why when you read someone like Lewis, coming from a Protestant perspective, I'm reading his doctrine, and I'm like, yeah, broadly speaking, we agree. But as we talked about last week, Catholics also read it, and they're like, oh, great, he's not spitting in our face and calling us heretics. So let's let's read it. That is sort of interesting about Anglicanism, and it's hard to get into that mindset. But again, take it for what it is, and something to keep in mind when you're reading Lewis and other Anglican authors. I'm going pretty fast here, but does anyone have any questions so far? Does this make sense? Does this kind of line up?
Basically, he's trying to get to the mere Christianity part, only the basics. It wouldn't divide anybody.
Yeah.
I think I agree on.
Definitely. Again, I'm not an Anglican. I'm not planning on converting anytime soon. But the fact that Lewis is an Anglican, it sort of uniquely allows him to do this specific job that he does in Christianity. As we talked about, Lewis got saved at 33. He researched a lot of other worldviews before becoming a Christian. And really, Christianity was the last thing that he wanted to sign up for. So all of these things make him an effective apologist. He can empathize with people that are completely atheists. He can empathize with people that are kind of close to Christianity but just don't like it for whatever reason. And because he's Anglican, he's sort of allowed to get away with this ecumenical attitude that I just don't see that often. Nowadays, if someone takes that sort of approach, I'm skeptical. I'm like, are you sure you're Christian? Is it a lack of courage that's making you sound so mealy-mouthed? But it's a different tradition, and it sort of helps for this project. Okay, put this up one more time. Lewis's major works. We'll be focusing on these 2 books. Hopefully, we actually finish these 2 books. I thought that was a modest goal to start with, but we'll see. And then this is sort of his nonfiction on one side, his fiction on the other, and maybe a suggested reading order. Okay. Let's get back into Christianity. As I mentioned, we were in book 1. We started book 1 of Mere Christianity last class, and the title of book 1 is Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And the question I kept asking you last week was, what is Lewis's goal with this book? If the goal of the book is to communicate to all of England what Christians believe, if that's the goal of the entire book, think about the path that he takes to get there, right? So what he doesn't start out with is John 3:16 or Genesis 1 or something like that. He starts out with right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And this is about a fifth of the book, so he takes some time on this section. We talked about chapter 1 already, the law of human nature. Just a quick show of hands. Did anyone happen to read chapter 1 over this past week? Okay, a couple of hands. Had people that read it, were you reading it for the first time, or had you read it before?
Long time ago.
Long time ago?
Feels like brand new again.
Yeah. So, did you have any reflections on it as you were reading, in addition to what we talked about in class?
I studied apologetics in depth years ago, and so for me, it was like right in the face, kind of like, I don't believe. So, well, we talked about law of nature, for example. That's
Sure.
something that, when you start capitalizing N, you basically deify nature.
Sure.
And stuff like that. And now, what he's trying to do is basically the law of non-contradiction. That's what he's trying to do. That plus the fact that we all have these common beliefs. They're all in all different stories, so therefore we're not that far apart.
Right.
But what they end up doing is relativizing Christianity, so that you can accept you can't, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, in Hinduism, for example, we can incorporate every religion out there except Christianity.
Sure. It's exclusive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wish we had more time to get into your comment. But if you're interested in what Mike is talking about, the abolition of man is a great starting point, right? Lewis makes this claim in chapter 1 that we all basically believe in something like morality. He doesn't define what morality is, so he doesn't say it's the 10 Commandments. But he makes this interesting claim that every culture across humanity has believed in morality. Now, this is I don't think everyone agrees with this, especially not nowadays. I think people more often will say, well, it's relative, right? The Anglo-Saxon morality is different from the ancient Greek morality, which is different from Christian morality. So how can you say that there's something in common? It sounds like you're watering down Christian morality. I would say, I'm sort of that opinion. When I first read Abolition of Man, I thought, no, I don't buy it at all. But the second time I read it, I started to get where Lewis is coming from. And he actually does this in an appendix. He goes through the sort of ancient documents of, I believe it's like Chinese religion, Egyptian, Norse, Anglo-Saxon, Greek, Babylonian, of course, Christian, Hebrew, and he breaks them down. So he's like, okay, what do we all agree on? We all basically agree that murder is wrong. We all basically agree that you should be unselfish. Certain sort of baseline things, like I don't know. It's sort of things that you sometimes have a hard time justifying. So like incest is one thing that often comes up, that like every culture ever has agreed that this is wrong. So Lewis is making this point, not that everyone agrees, not that there's nothing distinctive about Christianity, but he's sort of making the point that if God, as we read in Romans 1 last week, if God is writing the law on our hearts, you would expect a certain consistency across the board, because otherwise a culture can say, hey, we missed the memo, that's not on us, we're doing our best here. But Romans says that every man is without excuse, and what is knowable about God is revealed to him. So it's a specific argument, and it's a little bit. I'm not going into it as fully as possible, and it's one of those things where I think a lot of Christians of good conscience disagree with Lewis on how far you can take this. But he's going to think of paganism largely as preparation for Christianity. That actually had a lot to do with his own conversion when we talk about myth, and it kind of brings you back to the everlasting man. Because Chesterton had this idea that the myths have certain things that sound similar to the gospel. They talk about God and God's relationship to man, and they're obviously not correct, right? We're not neo-pagans or like we don't worship Aphrodite or something, but a sort of kind way of looking at these pagan stories is that God is preparing humanity for the coming of Christ, so that once Christ comes and dies and is resurrected, these stories that have been told since prehistory sort of get people paying attention. They get people sort of a little bit on board already. That, okay, we have this idea of God, we have this idea of a resurrection, that we are related to him somehow. It's a sticking point for a lot of people. So I would say if this interests you, The Abolition of Man is great. The Everlasting Man is great. If it doesn't interest you, don't worry about it. It's not the biggest deal, but it's fun. Okay, chapter 1, the Law of Nature. I'm just going to read this quote from the very end of the chapter because it's a bit of a recap. These then are the 2 points I wanted to make in the chapter. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not, in fact, behave in that way. They know the law of nature. They have a sense of morality, and they break it. They have this sense of guilt. And this is curious, right? Why would we all agree to hold up a standard that none of us can actually meet? Well, what would be the point in doing that? And what he's going to say is, it's not something we do because we came up with it. It was placed on us, right? It was imposed from without. And he says that these 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. I mentioned just briefly Romans 2, 14 and 15. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves. Now, another way to say this is that the Gentiles have a law of nature, which is similar to the law that was revealed to the Jews, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing the other. And I mentioned last week that last part about accusing or else excusing is really playing well with Lewis's idea of quarreling. Let's start this entire project by talking about quarreling and how do we argue with each other? How do we fight with each other? It's based on a law that we all kind of act like, we all agree on. So this is definitely at play here. Okay, chapter 2 and 3 are him taking the claims from chapter 1 and substantiating it. And the way that he does that is he will raise an objection that someone might have and then answer it. Okay, I'll read this. Some people wrote to me saying, isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct? And hasn't it been developed just like all our other instincts? Now, I do not deny that we may have a herd instinct, but that is not what I mean by the moral law. And this is an interesting question, right? We have other instincts that sort of tell us what to do. So the objection is, maybe you're making too big a deal about this moral sense, and it's just another instinct that sort of develops. The way that they're talking about a herd instinct, it's like, well, we're basically just smart animals, so is it really that big of a deal? That's the first objection, that the moral law is an instinct. It's not, in fact, an imposed law. The second objection, he talks about later on in the book, is this. Other people wrote to me saying, isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention, something that is put into us by education? I think there's a misunderstanding here. The people who ask that question are usually taking for granted that if we have learned a thing from parents and teachers, then that thing must be merely a human invention. But of course, that is not so. So this is the second objection, that the moral law is a social convention. And he calls out the fact that implied within that statement is that it's an arbitrary human invention. Now, in our day and age, people use the term social construct, right? Gender is a social construct, race is a social construct. And that's not a term that's really, that it hasn't been invented in Lewis's time, but that's what he's getting at. Social convention meaning something taught, something that we wouldn't know otherwise, but human invention, meaning it's completely arbitrary. Now, these are the 2 objections that Lewis raises in this chapter, and I'm not telling you what his answers, what his refutations are, but he does refute them. I want to say something about this kind of question, right? The moral law is an instinct, it's a herd instinct. The moral law is a social convention. many people in the world today believe this sort of thing, right? That there's sort of an evolutionary approach to how morality and selflessness came about. It's not Lewis's view, it's not my own, but I do want to flag something for you, and it's a question of rhetoric, right? In our day and age, what methods do we employ when we want to prove something or we want to persuade someone of something? That's the question. How do we persuade? How do we prove? We might use an appeal to a common authority, right? So in the church, you start from the Bible, you go from there, and as long as we all agree that the Bible is binding, that'll work. In other contexts, it might be the Constitution, it might be the company mission statement, it might be the textbook in the class, but that's sort of a common one, right? And you'll see that Lewis doesn't do that in Mere Christianity because he's talking to a mixed audience. So he can't take for granted that he has any shared source of authority. So he hasn't quoted the Bible. Now, what's another way of persuading someone? When I was working in the software industry, the rule of thumb was every proposal had to be data-driven, right? Show me the metrics, show me the statistics, show me numbers, results, right? My wife is in the healthcare field, and whenever I have the temerity to disagree with her, that's kind of the response I get. You don't know what you're talking about. Show me the research that talks about your position. And that's the way that we think. And so if we're expecting that going into Mere Christianity, you'll find nothing that even approaches a statistic or a survey or a chart unless he's making fun of someone trying to do that, right? That's just not his project. And that might make it difficult for us because we're not used to seeing arguments like that very often. So think about these objections. The moral law is an instinct. Now, you might think, oh man, I have to be like a Jordan Peterson type and talk about evolutionary neuroscience, and let's get into that. That's not Lewis's approach at all. You talk about the moral law being a social convention. Oh, okay, do I have to be like a postmodernist in a literary theory, or do I have to study education? Lewis is not going to do any of that either, frankly, because that isn't the grounds of the argument that he wants to get on, but also because it's very boring. These things are important, and what Lewis doesn't want to do is lose people when he's talking about them. This is the fundamental of the Christian faith that he's going to get to. So what he doesn't want to do is present the idea that you have to be an expert or a scholar or someone who's kind of disconnected from daily life in order to understand these questions. It's the way that Lewis grounds his arguments. Think about that very first sentence of the book, right? Everyone has heard people quarrel. So what Lewis does is he reasons from universal human experience. And he's going to stay in that lane as much as he possibly can. And the way that he answers these two questions is talking about universal human experience. So for the instinct one, he says, okay, let's think about it for a second. If the moral law is an instinct, well, I have other instincts that I grant are there. I feel hungry, I feel thirsty, I feel the instinct for self-preservation, I might feel the instinct to go help someone in danger. Is that this? Is the moral law the same? Does that feel similar? And he's going to say no. And again, it's interesting to me that he's able to deal with these problems without getting caught in the weeds of academics or anthropology. He's just going to say things that we all understand and we all feel. And this is a very effective tool. Right? It's effective because it's powerful. As Kyle mentioned last week, it's a little bit impossible to argue with if it's done properly. But what's also effective about it is it's understandable to everyone, right? So Lewis can stay grounded. He can stay in the fight, but he can stay grounded without losing people. And he can kind of, it should speak for itself. Is Lewis able to defend Christianity, its very basic fundamental things, in a way that everyone understands? And I think that because we don't see this that often, because a lot of times in our day and age, it comes to my academic credentials or my kind of experience. This is not that. So it's sort of good exposure for us to see someone engage rhetorically in this way. Okay, I'm going to go to chapter 3, but does anyone have any questions on chapter 2? Chapter 3 is some more objections. But did you have a question?
Is that when I did read it a couple months ago.
Okay.
Before I knew this class. Is that where he says, I'm hungry, so there must be food. I drink, so that I get thirsty, so there must be water. I want justice, so there must be some out there.
Yeah,
or it must come from somewhere else.
It's a classic Lewis line. I don't think it's in this chapter.
Okay.
I'm not sure where it is, but it's a similar argument, right? That our instincts are created for a purpose. But yeah, if you find where that is, let me know. I don't think it's in here. But yeah, it's a classic Lewis line. Okay, we're going to talk about chapter 3. So in chapter 2, he talked about some objections, right? These 2 objections. And chapter 3, he's going to talk about objections of a different kind, but that's still kind of the goal. He sort of talks about laws of nature, right? In the first chapter, he was saying that we have laws of nature, things like gravity and physics and sonic waves and whatnot. And then we have the law of human nature. Now, it's almost weird for us to think of those 2 things as the same category. And he's going to grant them. He's going to say the laws of nature are descriptive, in that when you sort of throw a projectile, you can look up the formula in your physics class, and that formula is going to be right, basically 100% of the time. And so what he's saying is that in nature, the law and the facts are the same thing, right? You have the facts. This is how stones behave when you throw them. And you have these physical laws, and they're identical. They are essentially the same thing. With human nature, though, it's different, right? You have these laws, morality, and then you have the facts, which is how humans actually do behave. And they're different. Why is that? Why should that be the case, right? And this is strange enough that he wants to deal with some objections that try to explain away the strangeness. So the first objection is that the moral law is not really something placed upon us. It's sort of derived based on convenience. So if you do something that's convenient to me, I would call that a good thing. And if you do something inconvenient to me, I would call that a bad thing. And this is, again, a lot of people today basically think that this is how morality is invented. It's just, we all live together, we kind of live in the real world, and we come up with these sets of rules that sort of serve people as best as possible. Again, that's not something that he believes. He's going to refute it. The second objection is that the moral law is based on the common good, right? So the problem with the first thing is that there are certain actions that we don't take, even though they are convenient, but they're not moral, something like cheating on a test. And so he brings up, well, the person might respond and say, well, the reason that you don't do those things, even though they're personally, convenient for you, is because if everyone did them, we wouldn't live in a very stable world. So we all kind of pitch in, and that's where morality comes from. Hugely influential view, right? Sometimes you think of utilitarianism. And if you read the people that are of that philosophical school, that's basically their argument. Their argument is, this is the origin of morality. This is what morality is, which is accomplishing the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. Super common. Most political conversations you will see have kind of this at their foundations. And again, Lewis is going to say, that it's not like you can't accomplish good for people by being good, but that's not the essence of morality. That's not the origin of morality. It really is something different. This is his sort of conclusion at the end of chapter 3. And what he's going to basically say is that moral law isn't something you can reverse engineer. It's not something that you can invent and justify from some other domain, that you act morally because it's personally good for you, it's societally good for you. That just doesn't hold up. So I'm going to read this passage. This rule of right or wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow or other be a real thing, a thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. It's going to say it's not an invention. It exists somehow. And yet is not a fact in the ordinary sense. In the same way as our actual behavior, that is our failing of the moral law, is a fact. It begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is something more than that there is more than one kind of reality. That in this particular case, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of man's behavior, and yet real, yet quite definitely real. A real law, which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. So what he is going to say is that even though the law of nature in the rocks and the trees, it's easy to justify because we can do the math and we can observe it and they always match up. Just because that's not the case with human nature doesn't mean we get to dispense with the law and just talk about the facts. This law is somehow real, and it's none of us made it. We can't come up with a reason why humans would have invented it, but it's here. It's been placed upon us.
So is he basically making an argument for the constant, right? So that
Could you
there's
elaborate?
that there are constants, right? And the fact that there are constants in universal experience being a constant, right? That nobody really can debate or deny. That in and of itself is the law. That there are these things that are. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And yeah, I think a common way of discussing this are there absolutes, right? Does everything have to be rationally justified? That's sometimes called positivism. Or are there absolutes, like absolute reality, absolute truth, absolute goodness? I think you would love the abolition of man if you haven't read it already. Because that is his argument more so in that book.
What's his argument?
What you're saying about
Okay.
constants, about absolutes, that the fact that they exist and the fact that they're incontrovertible points towards God.
But that's not what he's doing here.
That's not
You don't
really
think?
what he's doing here. So the bolded section I have is there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of mental behavior. And that something above and beyond is moral law, specifically moral law, not just common ground, not just some sort of constant. The question is, we have this moral law, and it's opinionated, right? It says some things are this way, some things ought not to be done. What he's really getting at is a transcendent being, a God,
Outside of us.
outside of us,
A force
right?
outside of us.
Yeah, if you look at Romans 2, that section that
And he's making that argument by saying because we don't do it the way we know that it's
Yeah.
saying that we ought to.
Exactly.
So that means it's against us.
Yeah.
And he's making that argument that since it's against us, it's got to be outside. of us.
It has
And
to
is he
be.
making that?
Someone else had
Is that
to
the
hold
steps
us.
he's making?
Exactly. Yeah.
And this
And-
is what happened at Nuremberg, exactly that, because people say, you can't judge me according to French
Right.
law or English law.
It's true.
And it was the Lex Rex, Rex Lex argument. The Führer said this, he was the law,
Right.
and we followed orders. And they were right in that regard if it was Rex Lex.
Exactly.
But he argued for a transcendent standard that had to be God-given.
Yeah. He has and actually a section in Resignation. Apologize. And again, this is a talk that would have been given in 1941, right? So the war is very much still going on. England is obviously in it, but it's not a done deal, right? So this is in chapter 1. Okay. This law was called the law of nature because people thought that everyone knew it by nature and did not need to be taught it. They did not mean, of course, that you might not find an odd individual here and there who did not know it, just as you find a few people who are colorblind or have no ear for a tune. But taking the race as a whole, they thought that the human idea of decent behavior was obvious to everyone, and I believe they were right. This is the section. If they were not, then all the things we say about the war are nonsense. What was the sense in saying the enemy were in the wrong, unless right is a real thing, which the Nazis at bottom knew as well as we did and ought to have practiced? If they had had no notion of what we meant by right, then, though we might still have had to fight them, we could no more have blamed them for that than for the color of their hair. And this really goes back to this idea of quarreling. When you quarrel with someone, there's a common standard. And so when you quarrel with Nazis, in a war, you're still kind of telling them, you should have known better. I'm not excusing the fact that you're from a different culture, different tradition. None of that excuses you. You knew this was wrong. You did it. You have to fight. Now, this is the law of human nature, specifically as a constant. That's why I'm saying his argument is a little bit more specific. And it does have to do with the fact that we all agree with it. None of us measure up. So none of us is incentivized to agree with this if this was like a social convention. We invented it. We just kind of use it because it's convenient for us. But I don't want to get ahead of where Lewis is going, right? we're studying this in a church, so we know that Lewis is a Christian and he's getting to the idea of a Christian God. But he says repeatedly, I'm not there yet, right? We're about 30 pages into the book in chapter 3, and he's not said the word God even once. He's taking his time to get there. And actually, if we get to chapter 5, he'll sort of come out and talk about his own method. But this is the recap, right? We have a law of nature, which is descriptive, and we have a law of human nature, which is prescriptive, meaning it's telling us what to do. And that distinction points us to something above the law. We know that he's going to get to God, isn't that? Okay, chapter 4. What lies behind the law, right? If this law exists above and beyond the fact, what's beyond that? Who's the lawgiver? Now Lewis is going to stop thinking about humanity as such and focus his attention to the universe, right? If you remember that line from chapter 1, these two ideas are the start of all foundational thinking about man and the universe. So now he's going to talk about the universe with relation to what we're just saying. And he mentioned that there's two views of the nature and the origin of the universe. Both of them are as old as time. It's not that one is newer or one is older. Everyone always believed one of these two things at some point. And those views are the materialist view and the religious view. Not the Christian view, just the religious view. The materialist view is that the world somehow, we're obviously here, it must have started, or maybe it never started, it was always the case, but it just exists. And the religious view is some thing created it and controls it. Now, let's read this section. Please do not think that one of these views was held a long time ago and the other has gradually taken its place. Wherever there have been thinking men, both views turn up. And note this too, you cannot find out which view is the right one by science in the ordinary sense. Science works by experiments. Do not think I am saying anything against science. I'm only saying what its job is. Now this is true. I mean, you go back to some of the oldest documents we have. There are ancient Greeks out there saying, these gods, we tell stories about them, but they're not really real. So atheism is as old as time. Creationism is as old as time. You can imagine Lewis is writing in the 20th century. So Darwinism is huge, right? Like scientific materialism, really a big deal. And that's what he's saying. Don't think that this is progressive. We finally figured this out. Always thought this in some context. So let's hash it out. Science is limited, right? Science is observation. He has a line in here where he's like, any scientific claim is going to be just an observation. It's never going to prove a reason for something. It's never going to tell you why the universe came into existence. Merely that it is now, let's deal with it. If there is something behind, meaning if there's some sort of creative force, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known in some different way. After all, it is really a matter of common sense. You remember what I was saying earlier about these common sense arguments, right? He's not a scientist. Supposing science ever became complete, so that it knew every single thing in the whole universe, is it not plain that the questions, why is there a universe? Why does it go on as it does? Has it a meaning? Would remain just as they were, which is to say, unanswered, right? I think this is an interesting thought experiment. Imagine if we knew every single fact ever. If Wikipedia was complete and accurate and easily searchable, would you find the answers to these questions on it? Lewis is going to say no, and then any scientist worth his salt is going to say no. Obviously, you all know that as a society, we've advanced much further down this scientific track, which a lot of our sort of prominent philosophers are basically just scientists looking what they have and imposing a kind of philosophical framework upon it. But Lewis is going to say, that's not really scientists, that's not really science, and any honest scientist will tell you that that's the case. So,
is he making is that epistemology, and he's making an epistemological claim that no, we cannot know it all? He's universe just saying no, it's not possible for us to know the sum of knowledge.
No.
Is that what that is?
No, he's talking about science as observational, as empirical.
Oh, that science is limited because it's
science,
empirical.
Right. Science is great, right? He's going to say, no knock on science, it's great, we
He's
love
just
it.
saying beyond the veil of
Yes.
empiricism.
Narratives.
He's going to say
that there's reality, there's knowledge, there's
Yeah.
truth.
I mean, and again, sorry, I keep coming back to abolition of man. The abolition of man is really came on a lot of things when it came to the role of science, the kind of philosophy that originated science as we see it now, but where are its limits, right, as a field? Again, I mean, I was in tech industries. These people eat, live, and breathe science, and there's this sort of idea out there called scientism, that science has no limits, meaning if we can't figure something out in science, it doesn't exist, or that we can figure out in science.
Totally.
Just give us a bit of time, and we'll figure it out. Lewis is just going to say science is a very specific thing. It's empirical, means you run experiments, and it's observational. So it's limited, and once we start asking these questions that are outside of the authority of science, we're going to have to go to philosophy, we're going to have to go to religion. He's not going to say that, but he's just making this sort of put science in its place,
An
right?
example of that is Big Bang. Because
Yeah.
Big Bang originally started out with a closed universe. When they said the universe is endless, infinite, they went, that's a theological
Yeah,
discussion. They went beyond science.
That's why I'm not a big fan of science versus religion. I mean, it's really, I just think that like that's sort of an easy debate for the other side to kind of bait us into getting into, but they're just doing different things.
It's not against, it's just rightly ordered.
It is rightly ordered, and that's what Lewis is going to be arguing. If we put science in its proper place, it can be useful, but let's not ask it to do more than it can do. And if we're asking
And
it to tell
admit that
us,
it can only do so much.
yeah, if we're asking it to tell us the origin of the universe, the meaning of the universe, it's not going to work. But again, I talk to a lot of people that say, well, I don't really go for religion. Like, I believe in science. And, like, that's just not an answer, right? They just don't have an answer to these questions.
So thanks for that clarification.
Of course. No, certainly. Now, I want to go back to this quote. If there is something behind the law, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known to us in some different way. Just based on what we've talked about, try not to think about the fact that you know the Bible. Just think about your knowledge of mere Christianity so far. In what way has this something made itself known to man? Just based on what we talked about already. Moral law. Exactly. We come full circle, right? Lewis is going to say we can learn stuff about the universe objectively, from the outside. We can observe it. We can say, oh, it seems to act this way. But we don't have to do that with man because we are man. So we have this kind of inside knowledge. We have insider information on what it's like to be a man. And if there was something out there that wanted to make itself known to us, this would be the way that it would make itself known to us. Excellent. So this kind of shows why he went from moral law to the origin of the universe, but he's just going to say, like, these are basic. I haven't mentioned the Bible. I haven't really mentioned any, like, expertise on either side. This is just pure human experience. And we get into chapter 5. I love the title of chapter 5. We have cause to be uneasy. Why is that the case? Right? And we'll get into that. But Lewis does something very interesting in this chapter. He kind of heads off some people. He says, if you just read this past chapter where I started out talking about origin of the universe, and I seemed to be implying something like a God, you might be pretty annoyed with me right now because you expected me to be reasoned, objective, and I'm just sort of another Christian. And I don't want you to think of that because we're still pretty far off from the Christian God. We're still miles away from the Christian God. All I've said is that there is a something outside, and the origin of the universe has something to do with it, and the origin of the moral law has something to do with it. Now, to us, again, we have the answer in mind. But even for us, I think Lewis's direct address to the audience should be a kind of, like I said, a note to slow down. Take it easy. Let's not miss where Lewis is going. So, if we haven't gotten to the Christian God yet, what have we got so far? We have two bits of evidence about this somebody. One is the universe he has made, from which we conclude that he was a great artist, for the universe is a very beautiful place, but also that he is quite merciless and no friend to man, for the universe is a very dangerous and terrifying place. The other bit of evidence is that moral law which he has put into our minds, from which we conclude that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct. This is all we know from the two things that we've established so far. Are we in the Christian God territory? Well, not really, because there's the line about God being merciless and no friend to man. So he's just saying, pump your brakes, everyone. Now he's going to talk about that second point, right? In that sense, this idea that the being behind the universe is intensely interested in right conduct, in that sense, we should agree with the account given by Christianity and some other religions that God is good, but do not let us go too fast here. The moral law does not give us any grounds for thinking that God is good in the sense of being indulgent or soft or sympathetic. There is nothing indulgent about the moral law. It is as hard as nails. It tells you to do the straight thing, and it does not seem to care how painful or dangerous or difficult it is to do. If God is like the moral law, then he is not soft. It is no use at this stage saying that what you mean by a good God is a God who can forgive. You are going too quickly. And I'm continuing to read here. Only a person can forgive. And we have not got yet as far as a personal God, only as far as power behind the moral law, more like a mind than it is anything else. This is interesting, right? So far we haven't talked about the Bible. What we haven't done is brought in revelation. We have not brought in a message that God has delivered to us himself directly. We've only used universal human experience. And what he's saying is, that actually doesn't paint a very hopeful picture of God. It paints a picture of a God who is brilliant, beautiful, a great artist, but he's uncompromising, right? He's perfectly holy in a way that the angels are terrifying in the Bible. Or think about Isaiah's, response to God, or Manoah saying, I'm an unclean man. I deserve to die in your presence. That's all that we've done so far. So, congratulations to us. This is not a very happy stopping point. And as the title says, we have cause to be uneasy. If this is all we know, if this is all we can establish. Why does he do this, right? Lewis is really building steam at this point. He's silenced those critics who previously complained that Lewis is just trying to get us to a Christian God, because this is very much not that. Without any revelation of God's character through the Bible, all we have is the existence of the world and the existence of the law. That we have a creator God who is perfectly holy and uncompromising. Our consciences are uncompromising, right? This moral instinct that he talks about, it doesn't let us off the hook. We want to let ourselves off the hook, or maybe our sense of self-preservation wants to, but the moral law, it doesn't really do that. If that's all we know about God, we have cause to be uneasy. Now Lewis is going to let us into why did he approach this argument the way that he does. Okay, I'm going to read this to you. When I chose to get to my real subject in this roundabout way, I was not trying to play any kind of trick on you. I had a different reason. My reason was that Christianity simply does not make sense unless you face the sort of facts I have been describing. Christianity tells people to repent and promises them forgiveness. It therefore has nothing, as far as I know, to say to people who do not know they have done anything to repent of and who do not feel that they need any forgiveness. It is after you have realized that there is a real moral law, power behind it, and that you have broken that law and put yourself wrong with that power, it is after all of this, and not a moment sooner, that Christianity begins to talk, right? When we share the gospel with someone, we have to start with Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And if someone doesn't believe that that's true, generally or about themselves, there's almost no point in continuing on. You have to start from there. And that's why we spent 5 chapters, talking like unbelievers in this kind of roundabout way to get to this point. And it is kind of impressive that he's able to get to Romans 3:23 without mentioning the Bible or even really God, right? Now this is the kind of barn burner that he ends chapter 5 on. I'll read this and we can close and I'll take any questions, but it's almost at time. Of course, I is, in the long run, a thing of unspeakable comfort, but it does not begin in comfort. It begins in the dismay I have been describing, and it is no use at all trying to go on to that comfort without first going through that dismay. In religion, as in war and everything else, comfort is the one thing you cannot get by looking for it. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth, only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin with, and in the end, despair. Most of us have got over the pre-war wishful thinking about international politics. It is time we did the same about religion. I'm going to end the class there as it's 10:45, so we'll need to head out. Please feel free to do so. But if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free. Does that all make sense? This is where chapter 5 ends. This is where book 1 ends. And the next 3 books are what do Christians believe? Christian behavior. Let's get into it. But this is sort of his preparation. So, is that? Yeah. How are we feeling? Good. Great. Yeah. Any sort of comments or reflections on all? Yeah, Mike.
I was visiting with a guy one time, a long period of time. I was stuck with him, and he had just as a freshman in a PhD, and basically the process was game theory. And we had contact negotiations coming up. So I said, well, we considered John Nash in this Nobel Peace Prize contribution with the law of the excluded middle. And that's when he started giving me all this material. But he said, you need to get this your PhD in game theory too. Anyway, we're talking about in game theory that there was this, you're trying to predict human behavior in game theory. So you have these war games, but occasionally, actually pretty regularly, you have this irrational thing that comes up that totally blows your theory. Mm-hmm. This is the crazy island thing in October. I forgot October. Anyway, then he says something like, yeah, my brother-in-law and sister are born-again Christians. I said, it's funny you mention that because Jesus said, the heart is deceitful and wicked above all things, who can know it? Which really basically takes your game theory and just turns it upside down. Sure. And this is what we have essentially with Lewis. Yeah. Lewis basically is trusting the heart to make good decisions and be consistent. But this is the 19th century philosophy. Whenever essentially Christianity is just the idea of original sin and having a heart that was darkened. And so we're assuming that this is one of his presuppositions that we can reason our way to God because our hearts are not darkened.
I don't really think that's where Lewis is going. I think what he's saying is if you use your heart to reason your way to God, what you get is this merciless, exacting judge. That's not the God of Christianity. It's not a God who can save you, right? It's just a God that's going to lead you the place of the ancient Greeks, right? They had as much wisdom as just pure natural revelation can get you. They didn't have a single answer about what to do about their own sin. So I think that Lewis has read people like that. I mean, he's a big fan of the Romantic poets, so they literally say this, right? I don't think that's where he's coming from. And I think what he's trying to do is show the limitations of that approach. If you try to do this, this is as far as you get. And if this is where we end up, we have cause to be uneasy. But it's certainly, I mean, yeah, many of his contemporaries would say that.
He's not Pelagius, but I don't know unless he knows he's in the same category that his heart has to be examined as well. So
it's a way of looking at it. Again, I don't quite, but yeah. Any other comments? Any non-PhD havers in this room that would like to say something?
I like your.
Go ahead.
Good.
Well, so I was reading that he considered this time period post-Christian, which, I guess, whatever. So, and maybe you'll get to this near the end, but I'm curious if he did this during the war as talks on the radio, and then came into the book. Is there any sort of information or data as to the impact that it made on that society at that time? Did it influence the British people and whoever listed? Did it turn their hearts to God? I mean, did it change from that post-Christian society, just did it make an impact at all?
Yeah.
I mean, in that time period, not now, later on, because it was written useful now, but I'm just curious, anytime you know, did it make a difference?
Yeah, we have some accounts. Now, when he talks in chapter 2, some of you have written to me this objection. Those are contemporary responses that he's baked into the later book. So we do have some people writing to him saying, not really quite convinced. What do you think about this? And he'll answer. And you do have some people that said, this is very shallow. I am not successfully comforted by this during the war. But you also do have people that said, this was really a comfort to me, a solace, a reminder. And there are accounts of people saying that it caused them to look at Christianity for the first time because it's such a violent, London was bombed, right? So people are reaching out. I don't think that he thought himself capable of changing England to, not a post-Christian society anymore, but are there contemporary accounts of people appreciating this work? Absolutely. And that is why I'm not a big biography reader, but books like this, Shiver of Wonder, they do a good job of collecting. This one's called The Shiver of Wonder. It's by Jared Bingham. They do a good job of collecting sort of materials like that. So yes, thankfully we do have some reports, but some people aren't big fans. It's just the way that it is. I think you also had it.
Yeah, I like that you're bringing in Romans and you're bringing in Paul's writings, because I see that C.S. Lewis and Paul have a similar conversion
Yeah.
and then they have a very similar reasoning with the Roman world of that time and the
Definitely.
post-Christian world of World War II.
Yeah.
And it's neat to see, the parallels of how he's arguing, just like Paul would argue.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sure they felt the kinship. Just very clear, sort of rational, a little bit of rhetorical, legal training, knowledge of like the classical world. So yeah, I think there's probably a kinship there. I think it is. It's 10:51, so I officially dismiss you all. Thanks again. So if you want to read for next week, just read chapters 1 through 5 of book 1.
1 through 5.
Yeah.
Finish 5.
Finish
Finish the
book.
first book.
Yeah.